Hi, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the Backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the upcoming book, The Only Witness, A History of the Shroud of Turin, which is a historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, we'll be speaking with Russ Breault. He's one of the preeminent experts on the Shroud. We're going to be focusing on the early references to the Shroud from the 3rd century to the 13th century. One of the interesting references, though, specifically to the Shroud in the Bible, other than the linens in the tomb, is from Paul in Galatians 3:1, where he says, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly exhibited as crucified." Now, that quote is from the NRSV. There are a couple of different interesting translations of that where you might be able to refer to the eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly exhibited, where it's slightly different. In any case, there's a handful of biblical references to the linens. And then there are many, many references, and Russ is going to be talking about those that span the history of kind of the dark ages almost from the 1st century all the way to the 13th century, and more importantly, prior to the radiocarbon dating of 1260 to 1390. So with that, let me introduce Russ. Russ Breault has been researching and lecturing on the Shroud of Turin for over 30 years. His highly acclaimed presentation known as Shroud Encounter makes use of over 200 images and unfolds like a CSI investigation. Russ has presented to hundreds of audiences from New York to Hawaii. He has appeared in nationally televised documentaries, including Mysteries of the Ancient World on CBS, Uncovering the Face of Jesus on the History Channel, and CNN's Finding Jesus. He was a significant consultant to the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. for the development of their high-tech interactive exhibit on the Shroud that just opened and is still open through about July. Definitely something that needs to be on your bucket list to get there if you can before the end of July. He's been to all 3 public exhibitions of the Shroud in Italy. He's a longtime member of the Shroud Science Group, and he is the president and founder of the Shroud of Turin Education Project, also known as STERA, which has the mission to advance the knowledge of the Shroud to a new generation. Russ, thank you so much for being here. So glad to have you.
Hey, Guy, my pleasure to be here with you again.
Yes.
And, by the acronym for my organization is STEP, however, not to be confused with STERA, which is Barry Schwartz's organization, of which I am a member of. By the way, I'm on his board of directors. But anyways, thanks again for having me. It's very. I think what you're doing here with these podcasts is really important. So thank you for including me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the correction. I will definitely make sure that happens. So today, what we wanted to talk about was this paper that Russ is just putting together. It's historical references of the Turin Shroud from the 3rd through the 13th centuries. And well, you can't quite see it very well with the lighting on it, but really interesting, a whole good compendium of different things that refer specifically or potentially not so specifically to the Shroud over those 13 centuries. So, Russ, what prompted you to put this together?
Well, first of all, anyone can find this article if you go to academia.edu and search for that specific title or my name, you'll find it, Russ Breault, and you'll find it. It's the only one I have up there right now. So I'm going to be populating it with more. But this is really important, and per your question is that there is this either or proposition with the Shroud, and that it either is the authentic borrowed Shroud of Jesus, or it's not. And if it's not, well, then what is it? If it's not authentic, then it must be the work of an artist. It must be the work of human effort, some way, shape, or form. And if that's the case, then there must be some trace of paint, ink, dye, pigmentation, stain. There must be some substances on the cloth to account for the image. But there aren't any. You have a whole pattern of blood stains that correlate with the wounds that were sustained during the crucifixion. Is it just paint? Is it animal blood? Is it human blood? Is it blood from actual wounds? Well, it's blood from actual wounds. In fact, it's characterized as the exudate from wounds, AB blood type, human male DNA, found that out in 1995. So the plot certainly thickens now. And it's not just such an easy thing to glibly say that this is the work of some 14th century artist. But the reason that I'm compelled to write this article is because in 1988, you had a confluence of factors that were aligned against the shroud. Because in 1978, you had a whole team of scientists, 33 American scientists, go to Turin. They have access to the cloth for 5 days, round the clock, working in shifts, and 120 hours continuously. And their primary concern was kind of answering two questions. Number one, what's the cause of the image? Number two, is the blood? And they determined that it is not the work of an artist, and the blood was blood. And so that seemed to suggest that the shroud could very well be authentic. And now that was 1978. And the results were published in 81. And then 1988 comes along, 10 years later, and the shroud was carbon dated by 3 different carbon dating labs. Nope, not so fast, because they came up with a date range of 1260 to 1390. Well, now the shroud can't possibly be authentic, must be the work of some 14th century artist. And so, but the problem is that these two scientific studies are in complete contradiction with each other. So you have one scientific study that says, seems like the cloth could be authentic. And then you have another scientific study that says, nope, can't be authentic. So now we have to choose, which one do we believe? Which one is accurate? And so then we dig a little deeper and find out what happened during the carbon-14 dating debacle. And we realize, and you probably covered this with some of your other interviews, I'm sure, but now we know that sample that was cut, the original protocol called for cutting 3 different samples. They didn't cut 3 samples. They cut 1 sample. Where did they cut it from? From the outside corner edge, the most held and handled part of the cloth, which we know historically has been literally manually held up by clerics and prelates of the church on a platform, holding it up manually for hours upon hours upon hours at that precise corner over 275 times. So if you were looking for the worst possible sample location, you would cut from one of those 2 top outside corners, which is, of course, what they did. And so now we have a good reason to wonder, to question the veracity of the sample. And then in 2005, Ray Rogers publishes his work. He's a chemist. He obtains thread samples from the main body of the shroud and compares them with thread samples from that same carbon-14 corner and says, they're not the same. Well, how can they not be the same? They're from the same cloth. Well, apparently, there's cotton mixed in with the threads in that corner. No cotton anywhere else on the shroud. There's some kind of a madder root dye in that corner. No dye anywhere else on the shroud. You have this presence of starch in that corner. No starch anywhere else on the shroud. So you seem to have all the ingredients for some kind of a medieval repair or some kind of a medieval reweave, or something at least at a minimum is awry with that corner. Now, a reweave would be probably the simplest explanation. Maybe there's more explanations. I don't know. But so now we have the most significant carbon dating event of the 20th century, hanging on one questionable sample that now has come under a great deal of scrutiny as to whether it is in fact representative of the entire cloth. So it bears, so now we're brought into juxtaposition again between these two scientific efforts, 78 versus 88. Which one is correct? Well, I can tell you right now, carbon 14 is not correct. And that's where this paper comes in. And you can find it on academia. And because, so now let's put science aside, because science can only take you so far. And now we're going to have to look at the historical trail. Now I'm going to tell you how the stars were aligned in 88 against the shroud. And that's this. So it was said that the person who had possession of the shroud in France, when it was revealed in Western Europe for the first time, was Geoffrey de Charnay, the most honorable noble knight of the 14th century. I mean, this guy was well regarded by kings and nobles. I mean, he was commissioned by King James to write the book on chivalry. I mean, this guy was the man. I mean, he was like the Billy Graham of knights, and it's so here he is. You know, he has this shroud in 1356. Well, 1356, right smack in the date range between 1260 and 1390. That proves it. The shroud must have originated with Geoffrey. He must have concocted it or hired someone to fabricate it. He must be involved in this fraud. Yet there's nothing about Geoffrey that would suggest that he would ever be party to a fraud. And then you have another star that also aligned at that same time, which is called the Darcis Memorandum. Now, Pierre Darcis was the bishop of Troyes, and we might say Troy here in the United States. This is in France, and so the bishop in 1389, Geoffrey de Charnay's son, was going to exhibit the shroud again in 1389 in Lorraine. Well, the bishop Darcis was upset, because that was going to take pilgrims away from his cathedral that boasted several relics that were stolen from Constantinople in 1204. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then, and so he was concerned that this collegiate church down in Lorraine, now collegiate meant that it was established by the auspices of the Pope and not necessarily the bishop. So it didn't come under the authority of the bishop of Troy. It's kind of had its own sovereignty, if you will. And so anyways, he was upset because also in 1389, the entire roof of his cathedral collapsed. And so he needed some money. There's nothing about his claim that the shroud was exhibited in 1389 is the same one that was exhibited in 1356, which it was. But there's nothing about his claim that that cloth was simply the work of an artist. That's what he alleged. He alleged that it was a work of an artist, and this alleged artist had made a confession. Where's the confession? Not a single word from that confession is ever quoted anywhere. And so and now, 1978, we have access to that cloth. Sorry, Bishop Darcis, it's not a painting. I don't know what you were looking at, but it wasn't the shroud that we see. Also, it was described as a plain cloth. There's nothing plain about the shroud. It is a very complex 3-to-1 herringbone pattern twill weave, very doable in first century, but very expensive, which is suggestive that that is something that Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, would have had the wherewithal to purchase it. There's nothing about any of the descriptions made by Darcis or his predecessor that relate to the shroud. But again, here you have 1389, you have a bishop saying the shroud was a painted forgery. You have this carbon date of 1260 to 1390. You have Geoffrey de Charnay first revealing it in 1356, right smack in the middle of that carbon date. Surely this is the smoking gun.
Yeah.
But it's not.
Yeah.
As
absolutely.
they say, it was not as it seemed. And you know, so
and that's where we have the other side of the story.
that's exactly right.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it is so interesting, you know, and as you're talking, I could just, you know, a whole lot of different thoughts go through my mind as to what Bishop Darcis, whether he actually meant the shroud that was in Liray, or whether he had meant it was a copy, because there are copies of the shroud that had been made. So it could have been a copy, or it could have been that, you know, to your point, there was politics and there was money involved. And whoever says there's not politics and money involved in anything that happens. And even, you know, when you think about the radiocarbon dating, there was politics and money involved. And yet, to your point, Geoffrey de Charnay, you know, he carried the Or de Flamme, you know, a huge, a huge opportunity for him. He wrote the book on chivalry. He wrote actually 3 books. So there is no way that he would be a guy that would say, let's make a fake copy and let's show it at the church, the collegiate church in Liray, France.
Yeah, exactly. So the problem with all this is that these convergence of these 3 elements, carbon date, Geoffrey, and the allegations of Darcis, caused the critics of the shroud to look no further, to just assume that the carbon date must be correct because it correlates with these other 2 things. And they purposely failed or chose not to look at Constantinople, because Constantinople in 1204, we can call it the hinge of history. Everything related to the shroud historically hinges on Constantinople in 1204. And because you see, we know that there was a cloth in Constantinople, the burial, the syndom. It had an image of Jesus on it. And it went missing during the Fourth Crusade. Now, the Fourth Crusade was a horrible time of church history. And, you know, and the Crusaders had arranged with the Duke of or the Doge of Venice to build a whole fleet of sailing ships, to sail them down to the Holy Land, to Egypt, basically, and then they would travel on foot after that. But the Crusaders only raised about 1/3 of the money needed to pay the Doge for all the ships he built. So now they got a problem. They owe a huge debt to the Doge of Venice. How are they gonna fix this? So an opportunity arose. I wrote it down. The nephew of the emperor at Constantinople was kind of a suitor to the throne, and his name was Prince Alexis Angelus. So the gambit was to take him. The Crusaders would sail him to Constantinople, and the people of Constantinople, who allegedly didn't like their emperor, would embrace this new prince to be their new emperor. Well, it didn't work. They didn't embrace this prince, and they rallied behind their current emperor. And so you know, the citizens of Constantinople, you know, kind of naively, if you will, allowed some of the Crusaders to wander into the city before the battle actually started, and they began observing all of the wealth and riches of the city. It's like, whoa, this was a plum ripe for the picking. And so they couldn't work out a deal with Constantinople. They were not going to pay them anything to help them with their shipbuilding costs. And so what was left? They were going to go to war against Constantinople and just rip it off. And boy, did they rip it off.
And that was, yeah. And to your point, you know, at money and politics again, but most of the Crusaders only get paid based on what they can rape and pillage from whatever they conquer. So if they weren't going to be able to get it out of Constantinople, And at that point as well, because they didn't have the money, it didn't look like they were going to get down to Jerusalem to take the money from the Muslims and the current or the rulers at that time. Then what better opportunity is to take it from the richest, the greatest city on earth at the time, which is the city of Constantinople.
Yep, exactly right. 3 days of unbridled looting, ripping off, stealing. All the silver, gold, ivory goes out, and hundreds upon hundreds of relics that had been collected there painstakingly over the centuries, all disappeared, including the Sindon, the shroud. It disappears. And it's, of course, the Pope is livid with this. Pope Innocent the Third. He didn't plan on this. He didn't authorize this, because his hope, he was trying to unify East and West. Now there's no hope of unification now. I mean, they just destroyed their prized capital. That's not happening. So the Pope was livid. And so in 1215 was the Fourth Lateran Council. This has been in plan for a long time. And this was all, those were members of the church, clergy, bishops, and cardinals, all converged there in Rome, and it's and one of the things that was established there is called Canon 62. Now, Canon 62 was instituted because of all these stolen relics that were coming out. Plus a lot of fakes and phonies were being created, because, hey, there's money in this, like you just said, money in politics. Boy, there's money here. Oh yeah, this is the bone of Bartholomew. Yep, sure is. Here it is. Come get your relics. It's and so it became an industry. And so the Pope was very afraid that this was going to bring great embarrassment to the church, so he issued an edict in 1215, basically saying, if this was not a relic that was already venerated as a relic in Constantinople, in 1204, then it could not be considered a relic, and it would have to have special approval by the Pope to be authorized as a genuine relic. So that means nothing, all this stuff that was coming, if you couldn't demonstrate and prove that this was originally venerated prior to 1204, it could not be considered a relic. Well, now this is important, because the Pope issued a edict of excommunication on all the Crusaders who stole relics and didn't return them. Well, no one's going to return anything. I mean, and so these provenances all get bogused up. They all have false provenances now, with false stories about who this relic is from and what miracles are associated. It was all invented, and it's just to show that no, this wasn't stolen from Constantinople. No. And so it was all to cover their tracks. But now with the shroud, it just simply went underground. And so we don't know where it went. I mean, we have clues, but essentially it was really, there's not much information about where it was. This is called the missing years, between 1204 and 1356, when Geoffrey has it.
Well, and if you mind, the other thing too is, if you had stolen a relic, it wasn't not only that you had a false relic, but if you had stolen a relic, then the Pope Innocent III, he would excommunicate you. And because he wanted all those relics to go back. I don't know, whether he wanted them to go to Rome or to Constantinople, but he wanted the official relics, and he wanted those to go back, to be given back to the rightful owner. So if you had taken it, however, under what auspices you had taken it, you're not going to tell anybody. you're going to
Right.
keep it secret. So that kind of leads up to what you're talking about, these missing years between threat of excommunication and finally saying, hey, here it is.
Right, exactly. So, one of the theories in terms of who has it, where it went, was Othon de la Roche was a knight and a nobleman from Burgundy, France, and he was given authority over the Blachernae area of Constantinople. Blachernae was a section of the city, and in that section was a church or a cathedral, Saint Mary's of Blachernae, and a crusader, a chronicler, kind of a historian, chronicles that every Friday in that church, there was this shroud that raised itself upright every Friday. And it was probably, we think that there was kind of a contraption where they had a pulley system and pulled it up out of a box, gradually over the course of time. The theory is that, starts off at 6 a.m., the first watch of the day, just a couple feet, Jesus as a baby. Another at 9 o'clock, a little higher, Jesus as a boy. At 12 noon, a little higher, Jesus as a man, all the way up, Jesus, the crucified Lord, at 3 o'clock, which is the same hour which Jesus gave up his spirit on the cross. So that's what was happening liturgically with the shroud in 1204 in Blachernae. Well, Othon, he had jurisdiction over Blachernae, and so it's no wonder that he has possession of it in Athens. And it's in fact, there is a reference in this article. Hold on, let me find it here. So here's the reference that was written in 1204 by the brother of the emperor, and I don't know. I don't have page numbers on mine, but I think it's like page 4 here. Yep. It says, in April of last year, crusading army, having falsely set out to liberate the Holy Land, instead laid waste the city of Constantine. During the sack, troops of Venice and France looted even the holy sanctuaries. The Venetians partitioned the treasures of gold, silver, and ivory, while the French did the same with the relics of the saints, and most sacred of all, the linen in which our Lord Jesus Christ was wrapped after his death and before the resurrection. We know that the sacred objects are preserved by their predators in Venice, in France, and other places, the sacred linen in Athens. Now, interestingly, Othon is made the Duke of Athens. Athens is given to him as his fiefdom, as kind of a reward for his efforts in this crusade. And then, so there seems to be a clear connection between Othon and the shroud. Now, Othon eventually goes back to Burgundy, circa 1225 or so. He joins up with the Knights Templars. He becomes pretty high up in the Templars, but he eventually dies just a couple of years later. He may have always been in the Templars, but there seems to be a Templar connection. But I think it's probably as much of a family a connection as well as a Templar, because they were all Templars anyways. And it's the Templars started in Burgundy 100 years earlier. That was where they got that was where they originated. And so Othon probably has it in Burgundy, and in the trail kind of goes cold, but there's references to the shroud having been exhibited in Saint Stephen in Besançon, which is not far from Burgundy. But ultimately, circa 1350 or so, we see it as the possession of Jeanne de Vergy, who is the great granddaughter of Othon, and so it obviously stays in the family. And then Jeanne marries Geoffrey de Charnay, probably 1353 or 4 or so. And this is this linen shroud, which was in her possession, was probably presented to Geoffrey as a dowry. This is what they did back in the Middle Ages, so that, you know, in case something happened to Geoffrey, that it would return to her and provide a means of support, if you will. And it's and so this is the connection. Now it's interesting, back to this Fourth Lateran Council and this Canon 62, is that when Geoffrey petitioned the Pope to exhibit the shroud in Lorraine, the Pope authorized him to do it, but he had to maintain a vow of silence. He could not make any mention of where the shroud came from. Now, that's interesting. So now remember, he would not have been allowed to exhibit it had it been a new manufacture. If it had just been conjured up by somebody as some kind of fake or fraud, it would never have been approved by the Pope. But the Pope approved it because Geoffrey was able to prove that this is the same cloth that was stolen from Blackernay by Othon de la Roche, and observed there by that French chronicler, Robert de Clary. So that's really important. Why a vow of silence concerning its origin? Why? It's because if Geoffrey had indicated that this was from Constantinople, he would have been required to return it to Constantinople. And so that's why there had to be a vow of silence. Now, so there is another, the article mentions, it doesn't have the pictures of it, but
if you don't mind, let me interrupt you there.
Yes.
Two things. One of them is, we have the radiocarbon dating 1260 to 1390. And then we now have a date of the cloth being referenced in 1204, which then says that there's something wrong with the dating that took place, number one. And then number two, we now have the second reference, and there are other references as well, some of them more oblique, some of them more very descriptive. There's clearly references of just like this one where, hey, we need that shroud back, that belongs to us. And, and if Othon de la Roche took it into his possession as part of his payments, and, then he's not going to say anything, of course, out of fear of excommunication.
Sure.
And then also, a couple of hundred years later with Geoffrey de Charny and then Jean de Charny, they have it in their possession. There's a new pope. There's a new pope in town, and he's now not quite as upset as maybe Innocent III might have been as to how these relics got out of Constantinople.
Yeah, because it's 150 years later, and it's so now. What to your point, the reason 1204 is such an important date is because the cloth that was stolen in 1204 didn't just get there; it had been there since 944. And that's really important. So in other words, 1204 is already older than the oldest carbon date of 1260. And the cloth that they were referencing was brought there from Edessa in 944. And it's and so clearly the carbon date is wrong, period. Now there are, I don't think the carbon date can be looked at for anything. It is because we don't know how wrong it is. You could, well, maybe it's only off by this much. Well, how do you know? Maybe it's off by this much. How do you know how much it's off by? We have no clue. And so I don't think the carbon date can be considered for anything at this point.
Well, I think you can only say that the carbon date, assuming that there was grime and or there was cotton intermixed with an interweave, it probably dated that material that was used as a sample correctly, but it cannot be used. That sample is not and cannot be used as representative of the rest of the cloth. And
No.
that's it. So it may have been done absolutely scientifically correctly, but it did not date the cloth. It dated just that sample, which has contamination and has repairs to it, and who knows what happened to it.
So now let's go all the way back to first century. The most important reference is in the Gospel of John. You know, Mary goes to the tomb, sees that the stone is rolled aside from the entrance. She peeks in, sees the body's gone, runs to find the apostles. And she says, someone has taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and I don't know where they put him. Well, Peter and John, what do you? So they run back down to the tomb. John gets there first, makes a point of letting us know that.
The apostle who Jesus loved.
Yes. And then Peter finally gets there, hobbling, I suppose. And Peter goes right inside the tomb. John follows him in. And Peter sees the linen cloth lying there. John also sees the linen cloth lying there and believes. Believes what? Believes that he had risen. Now, so now he may not have understood what resurrection meant, but he knew something spectacular happened. So it begs the question, what did they see that Mary didn't see? Now, Mary doesn't go inside that tomb, and she just peeks in and sees that the body's gone. Peter and John go into the tomb, see the linen cloth lying there. Peter walks away wondering. He's not sure what he saw, but John knows exactly what he saw, because John probably is recollecting things that Jesus said. He's, 3 times at least, as recorded in the Gospels, that Jesus said that he would be given up to be crucified. On the 3rd day, he would rise again. 3 times he said this. And so John's saying, well, maybe this is what Jesus meant when he talked about resurrection. And it's so John believes. So this is interesting then, because it was the linen cloth lying there that becomes the first piece of evidence that Jesus had risen from the dead. And based on that evidence, John becomes the very first person to believe in the resurrection. That's significant. Now, here's what we have to ask ourselves. Was the linen cloth lying there only for the benefit of Peter and John? Or was it for the benefit of the whole world throughout all generations? That's the question. Because interestingly, the Gospels are silent on the shroud after that Resurrection Sunday. Now, even if it didn't have an image on it, it still contained the blood of the atonement. You'd think there'd be some reference to it, because in Acts chapter 19, it talks about Paul circulating handkerchiefs and aprons that belonged to him. He circulated among the people, and people be healed based on the anointing of these other fabrics that were in the possession of Paul. How much more of an anointing would the linen shroud of Christ that bore the blood of the atonement, how much more of an anointing would that have? Now, you got to know that this cloth was not destroyed. It was not thrown away. It was not burned. It was collected and maintained. Now, they might not have known what to do with it. Being Jewish, covered with blood, wrapped a corpse, clean. It's doubly unclean. Well, wait a minute. Jesus was dead, but now he's not. So is it clean or unclean? We don't know. Why don't we send it to the Gentiles and let them figure it out? It's well,
plus, if you don't mind me interrupting there, plus sure. You have the Sanhedrin, the Jewish hierarchy, basically probably wanting to find, if there is a rumor of the cloth, which I'm sure there had to have been, if there's a rumor of the resurrection, which there had to have been, then the Sanhedrin wanted to put that down. So if Peter and John or whoever else might have had it, Joseph of Arimathea or whatever, they had to keep that cloth in hiding, because they couldn't necessarily, let the Sanhedrin know, because they'd want to destroy it, or the Romans would have wanted to destroy it. So it had to have been kept in hiding in some fashion.
Absolutely. And you got to think that these gospels were written about 30 years after these events, when persecution was in high gear. And so, I mean, yeah, they're recollecting events that occurred, 30 years earlier, but they're being written 30 years later. And James was killed in 42. He was thrown, he was what, I think he was thrown from the pinnacle of the temple or something. I can't remember how he was killed. Then that's when they arrested Peter, tried to kill him. So persecution was hot.
Mhm.
And so they're not going to have any overt mention of this cloth, where it is, that would give any kind of clue as to who had it or where they could find it.
Well, and even Peter was prohibited from speaking about Christ, before the Sanhedrin.
Exactly. So this, so now this is a real interesting verse, or not. So let's fast forward then to, I'm going to look at the 4th century. Pope Sylvester instituted by papal decree in 325 that the church should celebrate the holy sacrifice of the Mass, representing the body and blood of Christ, on a linen cloth consecrated by the bishop, as if it were the clean shroud of Christ. That lets you know this is the development of the very center of the I mean, in every church, be it Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, whether granted there's different views on communion, but it's the central sacrament of the church, partaking in the body and blood of Christ. And so here, what could be more representative of the body and blood of Christ than his burial shroud? And here Pope Sylvester in 325 saying that the altar needed to be covered with a long rectangular linen cloth representing the clean shroud of Christ. So that indicated that there was awareness of the shroud's existence in the early 4th century. By the way, this is a very important point too, in that I get constant objections by people saying, well, John 19:40 says he was bound in strips, so he must have been wound like a mummy. Well, not according to Pope Sylvester in 325. And it's so then you can, now here's another one, the very next century. This is it's probably late 4th, early 5th century. This is Bishop Theodore of Moptuestia of Antioch, a very prominent theologian. He developed the catechism with the instructions before the celebration of the Mass. And this is what he said. And he was describing how the 2 deacons bring this linen cloth we just talked about down in, and here's how it reads. This is why the deacons who spread the linens on the altar represent the figure or the image on the linen cloths at the burial. Whoa. So here is a reference to the 2 deacons represent the image, double image, frontal image, dorsal image on the linen cloths at the burial. So, because obviously, they don't have the actual shroud itself to cover the linen cloth. So they're doing it as a kind of a symbolism. Now, I don't know where the cloth was, but obviously this is instructions for every church to follow. And go ahead.
It would be interesting too. And I don't know the history of transubstantiation, but in the Catholic Church, and at that time, when you do the blood and the bread, that is supposed to have the body and blood of Christ right there. So putting it on the actual shroud, or even putting it on now a representative of the shroud, is kind of one way to really see how transubstantiation from the Catholic Church would take place, because you now have, both of the Eucharist materials as being, right next to the shroud.
Absolutely. So now we move to the 6th century. Now, this is a translation of John chapter 20, verse 5 and 6. This is called the Mozarabic Rite of Holy Week. This is This is a group of Arab Catholics that immigrated to Spain. And it said, and they translate this verse of scripture this way. Peter ran with John to the tomb and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. Oh my goodness. That's not in your translation of John chapter 20, verses 5 and 6. But this is how they choose to translate it. Why? Because it must be based on knowledge of that they had knowledge of something, that they were aware of something that was in existence at that time. And so that's a really important verse. Peter ran with John to the tomb and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. That's amazing.
That is really amazing. And, so how it's interesting how then the different translations now, of course, this is the 6th century. So, you have the written down versions of what happened in Greek. And then as they, I guess, progressed, there must have been, to your point, some kind of a tradition that said, no, those weren't just linens. Those were with the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on those linens. And wow, what a statement.
I mean, it's incredible. I mean, they specifically retranslated that scripture to input something that they were obviously aware of. And now we go to the 8th century. Now there was a period of time, it's called the Iconoclasm there. So, what happened with these sacred images is that they really proliferated. And so all of your Orthodox churches, and Orthodox and Catholic were kind of united at that point, but all these early churches had beautiful icon images of Jesus based on the true likeness, which is what the shroud was called, in the early centuries. It was described as the true likeness of Christ, not made by human hands, and so these painted icon images based on the shroud proliferated everywhere. Well, it got to the point where there was a movement to say, this may be a form of idolatry. Maybe we shouldn't do this. And so there was an iconoclastic movement to kind of stamp out all these icon images, which is,
well, if you don't mind, let me add something there. As I understand it, so Justinian made some coins in 643 to 645 with a replica of the shroud image of Jesus on them. And these are the gold solitas, and then there were some other coins, smaller value coins. And right after that, then there were a series of earthquakes. And then the Catholic Church, or the church at the time, then said, those images and icons that you used are the cause of those earthquakes. And then that caused then those images to be removed. And then it wasn't until like 940 or so when the image came back, and they came back on the coins.
Yeah, well, in the 8th century, at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, there was an argument to bring back sacred images. And so this is from the Second Council of Nicaea, and it says, in the 2 years preceding the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus Vespasian, he was the emperor, the faithful were warned by the Holy Ghost to leave Jerusalem and go to the kingdom of Agrippa, still allied to the Romans. That's Syria. Thus, going forth from the city, they took with them their most precious objects. This is how the images and other sacred objects were taken to Syria, probably Edessa, and were to be found there. So this is a reference to how these sacred images were taken from Jerusalem and how they ended up in Syria. Then is regarding why, there's a story about how Saint Jude, Jude Thaddeus, I personally think it's Jude, as in one of the 12 apostles, was brought at behest of a messenger, was sent from Edessa from King Abgar V, who was dying of something, most likely leprosy. And And this fame and knowledge of Jesus was all over the known world as this amazing healer. Well, anyways, so the story goes is that Jude eventually returns to Edessa with a cloth with an image on it, and Abgar, he beholds this image, he becomes a believer, and he's healed. And so, these are also all your Orthodox Church derive all their stories, talk about Saint Jude bringing this cloth to Edessa circa 1st century, and then eventually it becomes known as the true likeness of Christ. And it's so having said that, then so regarding why Jude brought the sacred cloth to King Abgar, now Theodore, what's his name, the Theodore the Studite, not exactly sure what that means. He says this: the reason that Jude brought the cloth to King Abgar was to clearly grant his divine features as Savior, who had been covered with it, imprinted the form of his own face, and portraying it, touching the cloth with his own skin. Now, we have to understand here that in the early centuries, the cloth was folded up in such a way as most people only ever saw the face image, if they ever saw it at all. But there was this gradual revelation, if you will, that the shroud was more than just a face image, but it was actually a full body image. And so here's a quote from Pope Stephen III, also 8th century. Christ spread out his entire body on a linen cloth that was white as snow. On this cloth, marvelous as it is to see, the glorious image of the Lord's face and the length of his entire and most noble body has been divinely transferred. Well, now we know we're talking about a full body image here, not just a face image. So now by 944, Edessa had fallen to Islam, and so the emperor in Constantinople was concerned about the well-being of this most holy of all Christian relics, the true likeness. And so he sends the entire Byzantine imperial army, marches them down 600 miles to surround Edessa. But they're not looking for a fight. They bring with them 200 prisoners of war, bags of silver. They're just looking to make a trade. And so the Muslims are pretty sharp, and they said, we'll take that deal. And so without any kind of bloodshed or anything else, they return to Constantinople on August 16th, 944. And so the Gregory, the archdeacon of the Hagia Sophia, that's the big cathedral there in Constantinople, and it's he delivers a sermon that night in the palace. So if you can imagine now, here's the scene: you have Gregory up on the platform, the emperor's throne. They lay out the shroud on the emperor's throne and crown it with the emperor's crown. Then Gregory, he starts to deliver a sermon, and he's standing right next to the shroud, and he's pointing things out. And this is what he says: the splendor has been impressed uniquely by the drops of agony sweat sprinkled from the face. These are truly the beauties that produce the coloring of Christ's imprint, which has been embellished further by the drops of blood sprinkled from his own side. Blood and water there, sweat and image here. Sweat and image, not talking about paint. He's talking about sweat and image. And then blood and water, he's talking about the side wound. Well, now we know we're not talking about just a face image. We're talking about a full body image. And then in the 11th century, another reference is made. This is a Latin version of the 1st century Abgar legend, which we talked about. Jude bringing the cloth to King Abgar, the 1st century, who's then healed of leprosy. It says this is sent from the 11th century. But if you wish to see my face in the flesh, behold, I send you a linen on which you will discover not only the features of my face, but a divinely copied configuration of my entire body. So now what do we know? It's a linen. It's not a board. It's not wood. It's a linen. And the 12th century, this is from Odoricus Vitalis, these are tough words, names, who wrote the ecclesiastical history in 1141. This is what he says. A precious linen on which he had wiped off the sweat of his face, and on which an image of the same Savior shines forth, miraculously painted or imprinted. This image shows to whoever looks upon it the appearance and the size of the Lord's body. Once again, talking about a full body image, not just a face image. And then 13th century, this is from Gervase of Tilbury, circa 1213. It says this: the story is passed down from the archives of ancient authority that the Lord prostrated himself with his entire body on the whitest of linen, so that by divine power there was impressed on the linen a most beautiful imprint of not only the face, but the entire body of the Lord. So it seems there's a lot in here passed down from the archives of ancient authority. He's telling us in the year 1213 that this has been around for a long time. And then he says, on the whitest of linen, once again, a reference to a linen and not something else. So that is of course the shroud is linen.
And then, Tilbury is in England, I believe. And so this information is not only in France or not only in Constantinople or Athens, but then in France, and then it's already up to England, that there is this whitest of linen with an image of the entire body of the Lord.
Great point. And then we've talked about Robert de Clary and what he saw, and then we've talked about the reference in 1204 when it was stolen and how it went to Athens, and then the other thing that is really highly significant, but it's more of an image thing, and it's the Hungarian Prey manuscript. And for your listeners should Google that and look at it. This is a series of picture codexes that were bound into a book in 1192. First book ever bound in the Hungarian language. It's a book talking about the history of the Hungarian people. And the artist has various scenes. He has scene 1 where Jesus is laid out on his burial shroud, scene 2 where he's wrapped in his burial shroud. And the artist who made these images was an eyewitness to the cloth that was in Constantinople sometime between 1160 and 1170. Now, this is already 100 years older than the oldest carbon date of 1260. But what does he put on in his painting? Now, for me, first and foremost, we see a long, narrow, rectangular cloth enveloping the body lengthwise. That's exactly what we see on the shroud. You got to think about it just for a minute. I mean, the shroud's pretty unusual. It's 3.5 feet wide, but 14 feet long. I mean, I imagine there's any number of ways to wrap a corpse. You could be buried in a shroud too. We all could. You order it off of Amazon right now, $300, 6x9 is the dimensions. Comes with straps and all, and it's 6x9. That kind of makes sense. But 3.5 by 14 feet, that's kind of unusual. And yet that's exactly what the Hungarian Prey manuscript represents. Then on top of that, the zigzag lines that correlate with the very complex herringbone pattern weave of the shroud. And most significantly, you have an L-shaped pattern of burns, which correlates with a burn incident that occurred in Constantinople prior to that, probably an accident from a bishop or a cardinal walking around the altar where the cloth was probably folded up on the altar, and his censer, a censer with hot coals in it, probably hit the altar, and it was an oops moment where these coals fell onto the cloth, burning all the way through it. And well, those pictures, that's the exact same thing we see on the shroud today, and yet that L-shaped configuration of burns is picked up in the Hungarian Prey manuscript. that is the proverbial, you know, they probably overused term, the smoking gun,
The smoking incense.
The smoking incense that definitively links the cloth to Constantinople. So this tells us then that this cloth was there in 1204, stolen during the Fourth Crusade, goes underground, probably in possession of the Knights Templars, and certainly in the family of Othon de la Roche, and then finally reemerges in 1356. We're 150 years past the catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade. It's kind of safe now to bring it up, providing you don't tell anybody where you got it from. That vow of silence that Jeffrey had to take. And it's it kind of, so in other words, this is what nobody looked at in 1988. They just assumed the carbon date was correct. They assumed that Jeffrey must have been involved in the fabrication of this thing. They assumed that Bishop Darcis was right by alleging that it was just the work of an artist. And so there you go. You know, case closed. Well, I say the case has been reopened, wide open. And
absolutely.
And so, you know, so now it's important to look a little deeper, a little further into this historical trail. And this just touches the surface of it.
And there are, and this is great research. You know, and it's so interesting to see how many new pieces of evidence, just like you have them, and then now stretching it out to where it was here in the 3rd century, here in the 4th, here in the 6th, here in the 8th, and really now piecing that together. And I think, you know, what I would like to see is, you know, you talk about in 944 the trade of money and prisoners for the shroud. It would be really interesting to see if there's any documentation on the Islamic side, either in Persia or in I don't know where, but that actually says, yep, we received 200 centenaria of silver or 200 centenaria of gold or whatever it is. And to be able to then corroborate that transaction, because it has to be there. And then there's so many other pieces in here where potentially even in the Vatican archives, there's something written somewhere where, you know, it corroborates the other side of the equation. So you have, you know, Bishop Darcis's letters and you have him complaining. Well, on the other hand, you know, the Pope probably has something in the archives that is actually in there. It's just somebody has to find it. Yep.
Exactly. So, you know, we still have a lot of work to do, but man, it's just really fun with all these new clues are coming together, and it's so I think that there is a true renaissance coming for the shroud, and boy, it's right on time, because the world seems to be careening out of control, and we need something as profound as the shroud to kind of, you know, get people's attention.
Yeah.
And
yeah, exactly. And, you know, it's interesting too, is that, you know, you have all of us, you know, depending on science every day and everything. And yet here is this image, and here were these scientists in 1978, and they could only say it's definitely not painted, it's definitely not dyed. We don't know what the cause of that image is. And you had the best scientists in the world that at that time to be able to figure that out, and they still couldn't figure it out. And it may be that it's never figured out.
I think that's probably a strong likelihood. All the deep things of God are all mysteries. So I have a feeling the shroud's going to remain a mystery for a long time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and with that, I'm going to close this out. We've definitely gone over on time, but really, I love the way you did the argument. It's either true or it's false, and you either believe these things or you don't. And then here is now proof and proof and proof and proof and proof that gets us so much closer to being able to say, yes, the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And then even better than that, the carbon dating that was done is just, you know, has now been debunked and continues to be even more and more debunked, because it ignores this evidence. It absolutely ignores this evidence.
And there's one more important point also, is that there is no artist in the 14th century that had the capability of producing the shroud. Now, Macron tries to suggest Simone Martini. Gary Viken, he suggests it was, Nato Ceccarelli. I've looked at their artwork. Nothing that they have done even compares remotely to what we see on the shroud.
Yeah.
It's nonsense. There's nobody in the 4th century capable of producing this.
Yeah, and that is so true. That is so true. Well, with that, let me close this out. Again, Russ, thank you so much. We're going to do another one here pretty soon, which is on your pamphlet here, which is on that the shroud is the proof of purchase. It is the receipt for the payment that was made through Jesus Christ's sacrifice. And
Exactly.
it's a fascinating thing. And I don't want to hint any more at that, but it is really good. So we'll get together and talk about that as well again. In any case,
great.
yeah, thank you so much, Russ. And in any case, please go to guypowell.com, sign up for more episodes. If you see this one or hear this one rather on Apple or Spotify or any of the other platforms, please give it 5 stars, so that more and more people will get to learn about what's happening in the world of the shroud, and even more importantly, what's happening in the world of Jesus Christ. Thank you again, Russ.
My pleasure, Guy. Thank you.